As we continue our discussion with Sangwe, political analyst that joins us, we'll have Tony Modise, market commentator on our outside broadcast facility, Tsepo Kadima, political and economical analyst, and Jackie Shandu, political analyst, and Adil Nchabeleng at Transform RSA president. David Wood, we hope to get you back as well. We just needed to put into context what we're talking about. So when we were explaining about the economy being skewed, neoliberalism designed to essentially, perpetuate the status quo of business making money and the rest of us being on the bottom of the food chain. And this is the argument that Davi was making, that it's largely the state that has failed in turning the economy around by creating a conducive environment and speaking the right knowledge.
Maybe let me explain what is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, simply put for our viewers at home, it means this: the state adopts a autopilot approach over the affairs of the economy. They don't interfere at all. So if there are to be any regulations, you minimize those regulations and you allow private sector to do, because there's this idea that markets work better, functional optimally when they are on their own, and those is the private sector and that is the companies. That argument has already been disproved. There's empirical evidence that unless you've got a state interventionist, and also on the other hand ensuring that you can have a tax code that is appropriate to your structure of the economy, which is our disadvantage in South Africa. Our tax code does not talk to the economic structure that we have, and that is of neoliberalism. So the private sector, by and large, they are free to do as they like. But the point I want to make is the following. All the investors that everybody else speaks about, they are talking about people who are buying up government bonds. If you look at the corporates have not, the bond market, the corporate bond market, and I watch this on a daily basis in terms of what is happening in North America, in Europe, as well as in Asia. And I can tell you here in South Africa, the corporate bond market is exceedingly moribund. So unless we have the capital markets in the productive sectors of the economy, where we can see corporates starting to issue bonds, we can see corporates doing initial public offerings, raising new money. Hong Kong this year alone will finish at $30 billion US in initial public offerings. The JSE will not even do 10 billion rand in initial public offerings. So that tells you, you should not be surprised that your economy is not growing, particularly in the productive sectors. And look at your jobs numbers. When you look at your jobs numbers, which is fundamental, because the consumer, for your VAT returns, where you are able to collect VAT, as well as in terms of the levies by the use of fuel, and in terms of other taxes, sin taxes, which are consumption related, consumption from what? From income, disposable income. And when you go and you extrapolate all of these factors, I'm saying that is the chief source of our woes in South Africa. Now, it's one thing for us to put tax, but let us explain to the people at home so that they fully understand what is it that we are talking about. That's really what neoliberalism is about. Free markets on their own, and we hope they can do right. They haven't done right because they are sitting with a cash pile. And when you ask, why is that cash pile not taxed? No, because our tax code looks at the income statement and not at the statement of cash flows.
Okay, maybe there is hope. He spoke about policy reform. You were saying that there's consultation with committees, that may be one of the agenda points.
That has been the fundamental problem of South African economy. If we are not going to revisit the policies of this country, if we are not going to look at the ownership of the minerals and resources in the country, we will never get this right. That's why corporates do what they want. Remember, the laws of this country were partially adopted and inherited from the old apartheid system, and they did not work towards transforming the economy of the country. They are working for benefit. That's what I said. We are on a pilot mode. The corporate want the status quo to remain as it is, but we should not look at that. The land ownership in this country, the control of the minerals and the resources of this country, which are supposed to be the highest source of income, it is still in the hands of the corporate, the few minority and foreign so-called direct investors who are just here to come and milk the resources, make profits, and leave the country with. That's why today we found ourselves in a situation whereby pay as you earn as well as VAT makes more contribution to the revenue of the country than the corporate income. Yeah. And Cindy, that's where the problem is.
Cindy, I'm surprised that in 2017 you still have a so-called economist arguing on the basis of Dawi. when neoliberal outlook was defeated, even before it was conceptualized, I'm sure Tsepo would recall the bouncing back of the so-called first world economy, Western Europe and North America, particularly after the Second World War, is through the policy suggestions or interventions of people like John Maynard Keynes. And if you look at what they were suggesting and propagating for is full employment. Now you come to South Africa in 2017, Tsepo has just quoted a tax base of 6.7 million people who are employed in a population of above 50 million. Again, that tells you that you have such a small and ongoingly shrinking tax base because more and more people get out of jobs than there are people getting into employment. And so obviously it leaves the state with very little revenue through which to advance this so-called radical economic transformation. But also, if you don't break up these monopolies that are always hegemonized by the big four, the big five, it means you will have 4 white firms, and most of them foreign firms, dominating, right? The audit space in South Africa, it's KPMG, it's Ernst & Young, it's PwC, it's Deloitte. That's it. You go to the banks, it's Standard Bank, it's Nedbank, it's FNB. And in each industry, you have 4 or 5 firms dominating 90% of the market share. What does it translate into? It means, one, the prices are going to... That's what leads to collusion or so-called cartel, as we saw with the construction cartel leading up to the World Cup in 2010, where you had these very few firms who were getting these contracts to do the construction, agreeing on who would get what contract with the state at what price. So if the state, and it's not inspiring that Minister Malusi Gigaba is not saying, we know now that the way to go is for the state unapologetically to intervene into the economy and for Parliament to enact laws that will militate.
We live by faith and hope that this, after the consultation, some form of radicalism will emerge. But we saw the minister being careful, calling it economic transformation as opposed to radical economic transformation. And Tony Modise, market commentator, joins us via outside broadcast facility. Tony, in the sense of the minister having an action plan on how to increase government revenue, he's lauded institutions such as the Competition Commission and also with SARS now being able to trace foreign accounts and the illicit trade of funds. Does the market really take these kind of threats seriously? Because we've seen that they've gotten away with impunity when it comes to collusion and other activities.
Well, in this sentiment, Cindy, it was completely different comparing to, we need to deal with the facts right now that the budget speech was very honest, it was very straightforward. And whatever that the finance minister did stipulate within the budget speech, it was things that are really straightforward. And even though the market didn't take them as positive as we would be anticipating, literally at the back of widening deficit, the challenge is literally around that. The government is making funds in 2 ways. The ones through tax revenues, and the second way, literally through debt. And with revenues, the challenge has literally been with, like Mr. Padime just said, with high unemployment. With high unemployment, it's completely challenging for the government to reach its target that they expected. Obviously, unemployment rate has been the lowest in a good 13 years, or 14 years rather, of which it's been in the lowest. It becomes very impossible for the government to reach its target. Now the challenge will be in one way now, whereby if ever, once deficit is widening, it creates more room for the credit agencies to end up downgrading us, of which will end up having whatever that South Africa produce will be servicing the debt, of which we will end up being in a hole whereby it doesn't even get to be closed. This is real challenges right now.
Yeah. Okay. Just still on the confidence, Adil. The minister spoke about provincial and local government austerity measures, what they need to do to clean up house and ensure that they cut down on wasteful expenditure, etc. And to talk about the NDP, that there is a longer vision or long-term goal that we need to aspire towards that will deal with all the key pillars of health and environment, tourism and employment, etc. What more could he have done?
Look, in terms of from the minister's point of view, let's put information into context. One, government only has 1.56 trillion, and they're increasing that 1.56 trillion to 1.9 trillion in terms of expenditure. In the capital markets, we're sitting with 12 trillion. So when you make numbers, you must actually have an understanding of what is happening in the economy. So government has only one of the 10th value that is currently circulating in the South African economy. So that is one aspect of it. So where we need growth, it's actually in the private sector. Government cannot bolster growth by actually bringing in capital because they do not control the capital market. That is why when we talk about investors' confidence, we talk about people who are investing in the Johannesburg Securities Exchange who are bringing in capital. But most of the time that money is never deployed in terms of infrastructure development, housing, and ensuring that there's healthcare. There's new industries developed. There's businesses that are created that will provide subsidy housing for its workers, that will provide health and education for its workers, like in other developed countries. For instance, if you go and look at the Asian tigers, most of the Asian tigers, the requirement is, if you are trading in our country, if you're trading in Japan, Korea, if you're trading in China, the requirement is, as a company, you have the requirement of fulfilling what they call a social dividend, which means you must provide a housing environment for your workers, because we're giving you an economic climate which will actually bolster your growth as a company. Secondly, you must provide education, you must provide healthcare, you must provide transportation, you must provide lodging and all of these other things. Our companies in South Africa, they cannot even pay over 285 billion rands as companies in terms of the contribution to the tax basket. So what else do you expect these companies to do in terms of investing back into our economy? The current investors that we're talking about that are trading the shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange are taking that money into the funds, into the various fund portfolios that are sitting with it, and most of them are exposed overseas and not reinvested in South Africa.
You make it sound as if it's almost trickery in the sense that government incentivizes corporates to come and invest in here in the country, and then there's the skills
but they don't pay back.
and there's a little bit of a tax reprieve here and there. Who does it benefit?
That's exactly what it benefits the so-called investors. And I will forever use the word so-called investors because Adil has already explained what an investor is supposed to be doing. We don't have that kind of situations in it. But also, I don't know why is everybody focusing only on job creation that will bolster the tax purpose when we already have money from corporate that's sitting there that is supposed to be taxed and it's not taxed. If we don't create jobs, we will not have more revenue on tax. That's a fact. But I'm saying we are sitting with corporates which are not paying taxes the way they're supposed to be paying taxes. South Africa is sitting on a very strategic position when you look at foreign trade, when you look at trade between the East and the West, as well as the African continent. You look at the number of imports and exports that are using our land or our country to go to Asia as well as Europe from either the West or the East. And when you look at that, then you look at the revenue that South African Revenue Services makes out of this foreign trade. It is nothing but peanuts and a joke, which means these companies, due to an inefficient tax system that we are having, they've got a leeway of not declaring some of the taxes that they are sitting with. They've got a leeway of running away with the 12 billion or trillion that Adil is referring to. That is sitting
but why
there.
Won't that deter them or further?
Why are we not speaking about illicit outflow of capital as well? I would have thought that was supposed also to feature prominently, to say, look, we could have had an extra 100 billion or more in terms of the medium-term budget speech. But because we are losing annually.
The illicit flows to the extent of pricing. There is over-invoicing for imports and under-invoicing for exports.
Correct.
And that's really the bulk of your illicit flows. It's not so much of really what the Reserve Bank is doing or not doing together with Financial Intelligence Center, although that also still plays a bigger role. So I made some example yesterday. For example, coal is our biggest export revenue earner in this country, but viewers at home will be horrified to know that in the last 12 years, we have not increased by 1 ton the coal production in this country, and as a result, jobs have been continually being suppressed, and we have not been able to take advantage of the growing market. But the problem is also in terms of the structure of our economy and the incumbents who are multinationals. So they have been seeking production from other jurisdictions and suppressing production from South Africa so that we don't export, because those corporates and mining companies, the oligopolistic cartel of mining companies, have become politicians, and the state needed to have intervened, and the state has been exceedingly timid. These are some of it's a cocktail of problems that we have, which unfortunately we are about to sink. But is there hope? There can only be hope if you have the minister and the government, together with the president, that can be more decisive. And the areas, I mean, I spoke about it even earlier today. Now we should be horrified and dismayed that South African Airways supposedly is going to get a strategic equity partner. Now, let me tell you, in terms of the accounting rules, the strategic equity partner will demand nothing other than to control the cash flows of South African Airways, and it is common cause that South African Airways has got exceedingly positive cash flows. So that strategic equity partner will be coming in at a bargain basement price, because the most valuable asset of South African Airways, which is not on its balance sheet, therefore distorting the true value of SAA, in a highly regulated aviation sector industry, is the routes. And those routes are not valued on the balance sheet. But without the routes, it's impossible to run an airline. And now we are having strategic equity partner, so-called, coming in, who will control the cash flows. It means we are dumb cops, because we have done it before. Right. We had Swiss Air, we had a whole host of others.
Another element, again, I do not know why do people still get excited and worried about the fluctuation of the rand when we know officially that in this country, the Reserve Bank and the government does not control the rand.
Sure.
The 4 banks of this country that connived with 13 other international banks have been devaluating and controlling the rand. Why are we worried that the rand is losing value because of the minister's speech, when we know that the banks, the corrupt banks actually, I must put it on record, that ABSA, FNB, Standard Bank as well as Nedbank and the other, there are corrupt banks that have colluded over a number of years, and there's evidence on the table that they have colluded to devaluate the rand. Now we get worried that the rand is being devaluated.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we just have to give Tony an opportunity to respond in terms of the minister having to really seek counsel and the wisdom of Solomon so that he can unbundle and fix the perennial problems that we've had in terms of how the economy can turn around. This is almost a similar speech that we've heard from his predecessors.
Of course, it's almost a similar speech that we've heard, but then with the direction that the current finance minister is taking right now, it's a little bit direct compared to what we've been hearing in the past. The challenge is technically around, economic growth and also affecting investors. The gentleman in the studio just mentioned that why are we concerned about the rand? Why should we let the rand fluctuate? The challenge is we cannot ignore the rand because it affects inflation. Inflation affects everybody directly. So once a currency affects everybody directly, it needs to be taken, we need to pay more attention to, and we need to try to direct it in a manner that it will basically be profitable to South Africans and also to the South African economy. Right now, what needs to happen is there needs to be economic growth. And this economic growth, that inclusive growth that the minister has been talking about, it needs to be including the private sector, even the public sector as well, so that we can literally have a turnaround plan in South African economy moving forward. Otherwise, if public sector and doesn't come together with private sector, we might not see anything moving forward. We can try to challenge the minds and we can try to challenge corporate South Africa, but we might not be ending up getting anything because we already give them a free pass. Funds are already with them. What we need to focus on right now, we need to focus with what we have and how do we turn what we have around? How do we benefit for what we have? First of all, right now it's even more expensive to mine. Loanmin is about to restructure over 1,000 employees over the expensive cost of mining. Anglo is facing the same thing. It's becoming more expensive to mine. It's going to even become difficult, or rather
Tony, we have to take a break. We're going to have to leave it there at the moment. That's Tony Modise. He is a market commentator, Botsang Moilwa, Jackie Shandu, and Tsepo Khadima, political analyst, and Adil Ntabeleng, president of Transform RSA. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll take a quick break. We'll see you shortly. Oh, and Darvi in absentia.